This passage is slightly difficult to read because it's about philosophers, it's about the relationship between science or science in terms of philosophy, and the language is slightly difficult. All right, but when you read and summarize the passage, you find that again the passage has only 2-3 main points, and the whole passage is based on Karl Popper's falsification theory. All right, we'll find out what it is with a quick summary. I'll quickly read through the passage and summarize the main points for you. If you ask philosophically minded researchers in the Anglophone world, at least, Anglophone means English speaking world, why is it that science works? They will almost always point to the philosopher Karl Popper for vindication. If you ask anybody, why does science work? They'll say Karl Popper. They will always refer to Karl Popper for vindication, means to justify their answer. Science, they explain, does not presume to provide the final answer to any question, but contents itself with trying to disprove things. These people, why does science function? Why does science work? Because science does not say that it's going to give the final answer to anything. On the other hand, it's content, it's satisfied by trying to disprove everything. Trying to disprove things. It works through disproving things. Clear? Science, so the Popperians claim. Who are Popperians? Supporters of Karl Popper, is an implacable machine for destroying falsehoods. Science is a machine which disproves things, which destroys falsehood, and that's how science works. Popper warned scientists that while experimental testing might get you nearer and nearer to the truth of your hypothesis via corroboration, so you're working on your hypothesis, and through subsequent steps somebody else works and corroborates, yes, what he's saying is true. So you might come nearer and nearer to the truth via corroboration. You cannot and must not ever proclaim yourself correct. So even if you know you're very close to the truth, you should never say you're correct. That's what Karl Popper would say. It's clear so far? The logic of induction means that you'll never collect the infinite mass of evidence necessary to be certain in all possible cases. For you to say something is correct, it has to be certain for all possible cases, and that's you have to collect an infinite amount of evidence to really say this will work in all possible cases. So it's better to consider the body of scientific knowledge not so much true as not yet disproved or provisionally true. So what is the body of knowledge that you have in science? He says you can call it something which is not yet disproved. That is why we consider it to be true. Or it is provisionally true, temporarily true, till somebody comes and starts disproving it. That is what scientific knowledge is. This is from the view of Karl Popper. So this is the falsification theory, that everything that you know is eventually false. You can only call something to be true or correct when you have considered it to be true or corroborated and found out and proved it to be true under all possible circumstances, which is not possible. Therefore, knowledge that you have is something that has not yet been disproved or something that is only temporarily true. Now come to the criticism of this falsification theory. For all its appealing simplicity, falsification was quickly demolished by philosophers. So he says the theory looks very simple, but it was demolished by philosophers who showed that it was an untenable way of looking at science. How can you untenable, something that you cannot sustain? How can you think of something as, well, it's true as long as it's not been disproved. It's true as long as somebody doesn't show that it's false. That's untenable, that's unsustainable. So in any real experimental setup, they pointed out, it's impossible to isolate a single hypothetical element for disproof. Okay, in any experimental setup, it's impossible to isolate one hypothetical element for disproof. You can't do that. You can't isolate one element and say this is wrong. Yet, for decades, Popperianism has nonetheless remained popular. For decades, it has been popular among scientists themselves in spite of its potentially harmful side effects. But still, Popper and his falsification theory continues to be popular. Why should this be so? While all this was going on, three philosophers were pulling the rug away beneath the Popperians' feet. He says, how can this be? But after this, he comes to, while people were talking about supporting Popperians, coming up with support for falsification theory, three philosophers worked to pull the rug from under Popper's feet to show that the entire falsification theory is wrong. They argued that, and this is their point against the falsification theory. They argued that when an experiment fails to prove an hypothesis, any element of the physical or theoretical setup could be to blame, nor can any single disproof ever count against a theory, since we can always put in a good faith auxiliary hypothesis to protect it. One, he says, that when an experiment fails to prove a hypothesis, there are many reasons why that hypothesis could be wrong. One of them could be any element of the physical or theoretical setup which is to blame. So when you pick up a single disproof, remember that a person can protect the hypothesis with a good faith auxiliary hypothesis. This can be protected with, okay, this will work in so many conditions provided this doesn't happen. So they always can protect it with a good faith hypothesis. Perhaps the lab mice weren't sufficiently inbred to produce So if you're doing so look at the interesting example. You're doing an experiment on genetic consistency. Now, if the results do not really prove your hypothesis, you can always come up with the counter that maybe the mice, the subjects that we use, weren't sufficiently inbred to produce genetic consistency. Perhaps the chemical reaction occurs only in the presence of some other catalyst or a particular catalyst. So there's always a reason that we can, a protection kind of a thing that you can put forward to justify why a particular hypothesis didn't work. So you can't isolate a particular aspect of a hypothesis and say this won't work, because we always can protect it with something like this. Moreover, we have to protect some theories for the sake of getting on at all. How will you progress or advance when you assume everything is false and disproved? You have to protect some hypothesis just to go forward to go to the next step. Generally, we don't conclude that we have disproved well-established laws of physics, rather that our experiment was faulty. So think of any well-established law of physics. We've done it in school. We used to do lots of experiments. Now, when the results don't turn out the way they are expected, we know that the experiment we conducted is false or faulty. We don't say that the well-established law of physics itself is wrong. And yet, the Popperians were undaunted. The supporters of Karl Popper were not frightened, were not daunted. What did they see in him? Why? Why is this strong? Why was Popper so strong, such a strong influence on people who followed him? Then we come to why was Karl Popper so popular? Why were Popperians so influenced by his falsification theory? The historian Neil Carver argued in 2013 that members of the Royal Society were swayed less by Popper's epistemological rules for research than by his philosophical chic. So they were more influenced by his style, by his philosophical style, and his popularity, rather than the knowledge. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. They were not really interested in the theoretical knowledge part of his theory at all. They were more influenced by his philosophical popularity, chic, style. All right. Second, during the then he's expanding on the same point. During the 1960s, they had been pummeled by the two cultures debate. Pummeled means totally beaten up. that cast them as jumped up technicians in comparison. So the philosophers were criticized as jumped up technicians during the two culture debate, with the esteemed makers of high culture. So the people of the so-called people of high culture criticized philosophers as jumped up technicians. Therefore, philosophy was a good cultural weapon with which to respond, since it demonstrated an affinity with the arts. Now, if you're philosophical, you have an affinity with the arts and you're considered culture. So this was their rejoinder, this was their reply to those people who criticized them as jumped up technicians. They used the garb of philosophy to counter the criticism. Popper's account of what came before falsification in research was a good defense of the cultural qualities of science. So Popper's defense of falsification, or what is false in research, was a good weapon, good defense for them of the cultural qualities of science. He described this stage as conjecture and act of imagination. Medower and others made great use of this scientific creativity in order to sustain cultural kudos for their field. This Popper was not the Popper of falsification. So the one that people were supporting, scientists and others who supported Karl Popper, were supporting him not so much for his falsification theory, but for their way of interpreting his theory. Clear? Then comes the last paragraph, which will leave you wondering a bit. Science is profoundly altered when considered analogous to the open market. The notion that scientific theories vie with one another in open competition overlooks the fact that research ambitions and funding choices are shaped by both big pound and small pound politics. So he says, science is altered by open markets. Funding, scientific theories compete with each other to get funding. You need money for research. So scientific theories vie with one another in open competition. It overlooks the fact that research and funding choices are shaped by both big pound and small pound politics. Money, big money is there, big and small money that revolves around research. There is a reason why most scientific progress has been made in drugs for the treatment of diseases of wealth than of poverty. You get funding and you are vying for funding, so people who have money will obviously give money for research which will help them. So that's why he's saying it's not surprising that you have more cures for diseases of the rich than diseases of poverty. Alright, now what's the connection with Popper? We'll find out if there is any. That is the summary. Karl Popper, falsification theory, why was it so popular? And then the last paragraph which talks about science research and the connection with funding and big and small pound politics. From the passage, it can be inferred that members of the Royal Society supported Popper's falsification theory because at that time it was considered fashionable and chic to be a Popperian. Something about chic has been given in the passage. We'll go back and confirm whether is this what has been said. It was considered fashionable to be a supporter of Karl Popper. Is that what is written? Popper's theory was in conformity with free market economics. Has that been mentioned? I don't think so. Karl Popper's philosophy was widely popular. Popper brought cultural ideas to science, such as what happens before falsification. Now, B and D are out. We have to choose between A and C. A says because it was seen, if you are a Popper follower, you are a follower of Karl Popper, it was seen as being fashionable. The second one says because Popper's philosophy was popular. Let's go back to the passage. One of them is playing with words. We have to make sure which one. The Royal Society was swayed less by Popper's epistemological rules of knowledge, theory of knowledge, than by his philosophical chic. So they were influenced by his philosophical style, by his philosophical popularity. Not Popper the man, Popper's philosophy. Therefore, now we know which is the correct answer. We read from the passage, it was not Popper who was following Popper, which was seen as fashionable. Popper's philosophy. Popper was his philosophical chic is describing Popper's philosophy. Therefore, C is my correct answer. Popper's philosophy, his style was popular, not the man himself, as A puts it, right? Therefore, or people saying if you are a follower of that man, then you are fashionable or chic. That's not what he says. His philosophy was considered popular, chic, philosophically chic. Okay, so therefore the correct answer is C.